All right, Rabosai, good morning or good night, everyone. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Czinn Teri Kahn for dedicating all the Shimmy Batsheva this month. In gratitude to Hashem, and welcoming their first grandchild, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, to thank Benjamin and Elys Wohl from Elys Wohl for dedicating all the Shimmy Batsheva this month. In gratitude to all of those who make the shiurim accessible beyond the confines of the Beis Midrash, specifically Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson, to thank Shimmy Batsheva Messing, dedicating all the shiurim drashos this month in honor of the Bas Mitzva of their daughter Lilah, and Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the shiurim drashos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah, Leah Bas Avram, and great-grandmother Cyril Bas Rabdov. To also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Neil and Pam Weissman, for dedicating all the shiurim this week in memory of Pam's father, Chazan Yisrael Zundel Ben Yehuda Leib. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama and Abose. With that, let us begin. So today's daf is daf tes. Hopefully you did your homework in Meretz Hashem. So we're picking up on daf tes. We're picking up 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down from the top. So remember again, get a beautiful and incredible daf yesterday. We moved a little bit quickly, but hopefully you saw some of the beautiful agarata in your homework as well. So today we pick up with an interesting sugya. So the Gemara says as follows, Tani. So the Gemara says, Yavesh kizayis tivri Rabbi Nosson. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, remember we began this already yesterday a little bit, a discussion regarding the halachos of hotzah. So we discussed the idea that when you go out and you carry something on Shabbos, you're only chayiv if you carry out an amount that is significant, that is chashuv. So we spent already a little bit, this sugya began yesterday, we're trying to figure out when it comes to wine concentrate, right? How much wine concentrate do you have to carry in order to be chayiv? How much water do you have to carry in order to be chayiv? So the Gemara says something very interesting. Yavesh, if you go ahead and you carry out a dry measure. Now the Tikkun Chadatin says, this is talking about if you go ahead and you carry out congealed wine. So what's the shear if you carry out congealed wine? So the Gemara says, kizayis. It's kizayis. Rabbanan de Kesai, Rabbi Yossi Barbi, B'Shem Shmuel, Asya de Rabbi Nosson, Rabbi Shimon, Kimad Rabbi Shimon Amar Berevius, Kain Amar Rabbi Nosson Berevius, L'Chesheyi Karesh V'Yebo Kizayis. So I'll say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara does is something very interesting, which is equates the shiurim of kizayis and revius to highlight the idea that halacha l'maisa, what is a revius by liquids, is a kizayis ultimately in solids. So in reality, the Gemara says, is this the same measurement, the same way we said in yesterday's daf, that the shear for hotzah by a liquid is a revius. When we say that today, the shear for hotzah, the amount for which you would be chayiv for transporting on Shabbos, is a kizayis by a solid. It's not a stira, it's not a contradiction. Rather, again, one is the shear by a solid, one is the shear by a liquid. To which the Gemara says as follows. So that's the end of that sugya. Rabbi Simon b'shem Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Maisa beper das Rabbi Shemesa. Supposed to listen to this interesting story. Rabbi Simon says in the name of Yoshua ben Levi, there was an episode where the mule, Pir does a Rebbe, Pir does a mule, the mule of Rebbe died. So we'll say this now gets into a discussion regarding the halachos of Tum and Tara vis-a-vis dam, vis-a-vis blood of an avela. So now watch this. So the animal died, the mule died, obviously a mule is a non-kosher animal, the mule died, and now the shaila was the status of the blood. Apparently some of the blood of the animal got onto something. So the shaila is, what's the impact of the blood of the mule? They said ultimately, again, the blood of the mule does not convey tuma alts nevela. We'll discuss the parameters of this. Remember again, an avela is the carcass of an animal. We know that an avela, right, the carcass of an animal does have the ability to convey tumah. You might have thought that the blood has the same din as the actual carcass, but the Gemara says over here that they said over in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi that the blood did not convey tumah. Okay, Vishal Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Simon, and Rabbi Eliezer asked Rabbi Simon, by the way, ad kama, when we say that the blood doesn't convey tumah, does that mean the blood up to a certain measurement doesn't convey tumah, but above that measurement does convey tumah? or the blood doesn't convey tumah at all? That was the shaila. And I will say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Simon did not answer Rabbi Eliezer. And I will say, interestingly enough, not only did he not answer, but lo ashkach be almost sounds like he ignored him. He ignored him. So Rabbi Simon ignored Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, V'shal Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. So fine, Rabbi Eliezer went on, and he asked Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, what's the halacha? V'amar lei, ad revius tahar, yoser mi revius tameh. And interestingly enough, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said the blood of the mule is tahar up until a revius, but more than a revius, it will convey tumah. Ubash l'Rabbi Eliezer, al delo chazar le Rabbi Simon shmuasa. And Rabbi Eliezer was very upset at Rabbi Simon that Rabbi Simon ignored him. Rabbi Eliezer was offended. He did also say, it's interesting, by the way, we see like a number of Gemaras last couple of days, the people getting offended. An incredible lesson about, people are sensitive in different ways, and you have to be careful. It's this fine line that on one hand, it's difficult to be sensitive in ways that are unreasonable, right? There are some people that are just overly sensitive, and anything and everything you do somehow offends them. So it's difficult to be careful with people who are overly sensitive, but Lamaisa to at least maintain some level of sensitivity to people's feelings. So you see over here that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, that Rabbi Eliezer was upset that Rabbi Simon ignored him. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a moment. Rav Bibi Havi Yosef, Masni Adin Uvdas. Rav Bibi was sitting and he was teaching this sugya. So let's remember again, all of this began with the mule of Rebbe that died. And so the shaila was, again, the discussion over here was, what's the impact ultimately, again, of the blood of the mule? So it was said that they said the blood was tahar. So Rabbi Eliezer's question was, blood was tahar up to a certain amount, but more than that amount is going to be tameh, or blood is just unequivocally tar? That was the question. So remember again, just to follow the story. Rabbi Eliezer asks Rabbi Simon pretty much ignores him. Rabbi Eliezer asks Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and says, up until the revius it's tahar, more than a revius it conveys tumah. Rabbi Bibi Yosef Masnei Adin Uvda. Rabbi Bibi was sitting and said over this particular episode, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna, Ad revius tahar, yoser mikan tameh. So tell me, when we say same exchange, do we say that it's tar up until revius, but more than a revius is going to convey tumah? Uba'at be. I will say, interestingly enough, ba'at be means he did not want to answer. He didn't want to answer. So I'll say, so remember again, this is now Rav Bibi asking the question to Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna, and Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna doesn't want to answer. If you look at the Tiklin Chadet in Ba'at be, see, he didn't answer him. In other words, see, ba'ad literally means what? But it doesn't, of course, literally mean kick over here. It rather means he pushed him away. Right? He set him aside. He didn't want to answer. Amrali Rabbi Zreka began the sha'alacha at ba'at bey. So I'll say in this case over here, so remember again, so Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna didn't want to answer Rav Bibi. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Zrika said to Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna, I don't understand, because someone asked you a question and you didn't want to answer. You treat the questioner in a disrespectful. So we'll say this is incredible. So Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna says, I wasn't trying to be difficult, and I wasn't trying to go ahead and purposely ignore the questioner, but rather, again, my mind wasn't focused. It was a very profound Gemara. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna says, I was unable to answer the question because my mind wasn't focused. Why? What was wrong with Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna that his mind wasn't focused? I will say, watch this. So the Gemara says, Amrlei. I'm sorry. So, but Amarle Rab Zrika began the shalacha ad bad. Amarle began the lo havadaiti bi batina be. Because I was unfocused, ultimately again I was unable to answer. Why was he unfocused? Da Amra bichanan v'hayu chayecha teluyim lecha mineged. But say when the pasuk says now the Gemara is quoting over here the psukim from the Tochacha, right? So the pasuk says literally, your life will be suspended opposite you. What does that refer to? This refers to a person who buys wheat per year. Or he buys enough wheat to last him for the year. Rabbi said, now what's so bad about that? Take a look at the tiklin chadatin for just a moment. Shalokech chitin ve'in lo karka. He doesn't own real estate. He doesn't own land. So the tiklin chadatin writes, shetei ema shetei. I'm sorry. Ve'in lo karka shetei emes ha'aretz titzmach bezriyaso ve'tzarech mishayin nishkaf al yodei gshavim masha eno ken kishalokech al shana chitin del shana haba eni yodei im yiyalo b'ma likach v'im yechitin. Both say this is the issue. When you purchase wheat, you are dependent on other people. The idea is that when you don't own your own land and you cannot go ahead and reap the bounty from that land, there's a certain amount of insecurity. Now, what's interesting about this is as follows. It's not like there's so much security, right, when you're a farmer, because even when you're a farmer, you still have to rely on the fact that there's going to be rain, that there's going to be sun. But at least when you're a farmer and you own your own land, there's a certain level of security that comes from that. The notion of being dependent to purchase your grain from somewhere else yields an incredible amount of insecurity. The Gemara goes on, Upacharata Lilah v'yomam. Ultimately, you will be afraid night and day. Zehalokeach mina sidki. This refers ultimately again to someone who purchases again from the sidki. A sidki is a merchant. This refers to someone who buys a little bit of grain at a time. In other words, at least if you're buying enough grain for a year, there's some amount of yishavadas, some amount of inner serenity that you have enough wheat for the year. Even worse than that is a person who has to buy his grain from the merchant, which is even less. And you will not believe in your life. This refers ultimately again to someone who has to purchase his bread from the baker. So we'll say, what happens if you purchase your bread from the baker? When are you purchasing your bread? Each and every day. So it goes, so in other words, it's difficult enough if you don't have land and you have to buy a yearly supply of wheat. That yields insecurity, but at least again you have a year of wheat. Worse than that is someone who buys his wheat from the merchant a little bit at a time. And even worse than that is a person who has to buy his bread each and every day. He's dependent on the seller each and every day. And both listen to this. And Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna says, "Va'ana samichna apalter." Me, I rely on the baker. I buy my bread each and every day. So both say it's incredible. So Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna said, I wasn't trying to ignore Rav Bibi when he asked me the question. I was just distracted. And why was I distracted? Because I buy my bread from the baker each and every day and lack a certain amount of internal serenity. So we'll say, isn't this incredible, by the way? You know, sometimes you have an interaction with a person and you feel the person really didn't treat you correctly, right? You feel the person really didn't deal with you right. Maybe they didn't give you the attention you feel that you wanted. Maybe they were just curt. Or maybe they just didn't respond in a nice way. What's the musar, both say? What's the musar, the interpersonal musar? Is you never know what is happening in the life of another individual. You never know. So we'll say, see, here you have Rav Yitzchak bar Bisna seemingly dealing very dismissively with Rav Bibi, but it turns out he wasn't being disrespectful. He was just distracted. And why was he distracted? Because he bought his bread from the palter. He bought his bread from the baker each and every day. You never really know what is happening in the life of another person. This is the din of being dan lekaf suchos, giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Because even when you think you have the situation summed up, and even when you think you understand why a person is doing what they're doing, you don't really know what's happening in their life. So we'll say, okay, so what's the halacha? Remember again, we'll say, how do we start with this? We start with this by a discussion regarding the blood of the mule of Rebbe, or the blood of an avela. So what's the halacha? Is it mitame? Is it not mitame? More than a revius, less than a revius? So hey, Rabbi Yeshua ben Pesora, al dam nevela shutar. Rabbi Yeshua ben Pesora, he testified that the blood of an avela is tar. So ma'utar. So both says, so that seems to indicate to us that it's tar. So maybe not ma'utar. Tar melachak shir. Maybe what it means is it's tar in that it doesn't count as one of the 7 liquids, which makes something receptive to receive toma. But maybe it itself actually does convey toma. In other words, we're both saying, so it could very well be that the blood of an avela is treated like an avela. And the same way that a kezayis of an avela conveys tuma, maybe the blood of an avela conveys tuma as well. And maybe when Rabbi Yeshua ben Pesora said that the blood of an avela is tar, maybe what he just meant is that it doesn't count as one of the 7 liquids to make something else ra'ui lekabel tuma. So al taman tanina we learned Dama sheretz kibsaro. So we'll say we learn that halacha l'maisa, the blood of a sheretz. So remember again, a sheretz is any creepy, crawly thing, a rodent, anything else. So the blood of a sheretz is like the flesh of the sheretz itself. Kibsaro. Mitame ve'eno machshir. So we'll say, interesting here, the Gemara says that the blood of a sheretz is just like the flesh of a sheretz. Just like the flesh of the sheretz conveys tumah, so too the blood of the sheretz conveys tumah as well. Ve'eno machshir. But interestingly enough, we'll say the blood of a sheretz does not go ahead, it's not machshir, which means the blood of a sheretz does not count as one of the 7 liquids that make something right l'kabel tumah. Ve'en lanu kiyot sebo. And there is nothing else that is like the blood of a sheretz. Now, both say, this seems to me tell us what? That it's only the blood of a sheretz that conveys tumah like the flesh of the sheretz. But no other blood has the status of this, which would seem to indicate to us what? That the blood of an avela does not convey tumah like the flesh of an avela. The sheer tumah, so shedama mitame kibsaro, and ultimately again the sheer, right? The measurement in which the dam will convey tumah is just like the basar. It's just like the flesh. So the same shear of the flesh. So we'll say if you take a look, if you take a look, well, let's see. So we'll say, now just point out that for the flesh of a sheretz, right, the flesh of a sheretz conveys tumah even b'kadosha, even a very small amount. So the Gemara is saying the same way that the flesh conveys tumah in a small amount, so too the blood of a sheretz conveys tumah in a small amount as well. But again, for our purposes, the Gemara seems to very clearly be indicating that's what? That halacha l'maisa, the blood of an avela will not convey tumah. Rabbi Yossi, pligi bat shem oran. So Rabbi Yossi said, in fact, this is a machlokes between amaram. Chad amar tamei v'chad amar tar. One opinion said that the blood of an avela conveys tumah. One said the blood of an avela doesn't convey tumah. Man da amar tamei Rabbi Huda. Uman da amar tar Rabbi Shimon Batsheva. The one who says that it's tamei, he holds like Rabbi Huda, and the one who says that it's tar, he holds like Rabbi Yoshua. Amar le Rav Avduma demin nechusa. V'yeyos, this is true. To Rabbi Huda Moraina de Bein Siyah. Rabbi Huda was the posek for the house of the Nasi. So we'll say, so just as part of a matter of curiosity, so what is the halacha? So does the blood of an avela convey tumah or not? So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Rambam, this is in Hilchos Tumas Ochlin, halacha Yud, Perek Yud, halacha Gimel. So listen to this. Hadam manoi min hamashkim hu adam ashoses b'shashchita min abehema v'chai v'ofos tohorim. Aval gami kiluach ino machshish adayin chayim heim. Fine. So we'll say, so now listen to this. The halacha is that the only type of blood that is one of the liquids that allows something to be receptive to tumah is blood that comes out at the time of the shchita of a kosher animal. That's the only type of blood that has the ability to make something receptive to be makabel tumah. But listen to this. He goes on, he says, V'chein dam shchit chai ba'ofos hatmein v'adam yotze malecha v'marei v'dam ashchin v'abubos tam sabasar kol elo eno metamin v'lo machshir el harin kisharim peiros. Listen to this. Oh, this is fascinating halacha. For our purposes, only blood that comes out at the time of shchita is one of the 7 liquids which makes a food item, or any item for that matter, receptive to being makabel tumah. But blood, any other kind of blood, so let's say blood from non-kosher animals, right? Blood from an avela, from a mule, that blood does not make something roi l'kabel tumah, nor does that blood convey tumah. So, for example, what the Rambam is saying is that halacha l'maisa, the blood that comes out of an avela, in this case the mule of Rebbe, does not have the status of the nevela, and does not convey tumah, and does not have the ability to make something receptive to tumah. The only exception to this rule is the dam hasheretz kibsaro mitame ve'ino machshir. The exception to this rule is the blood of a sheretz. The blood of a sheretz has the status of the flesh of the sheretz. Ve'in lanu kiyot sebo. The Rambam uses the same Lasson, and there is nothing else that is like the blood of a sheretz. Good. So that's the halacha. Let's go right there. Tani Rabbi Shmuel, kavatz lo yisrom mibnei hashad. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Shmuel says, someone with long hair. We'll say, coming back to, remember again, the Mishnah said that when you go in to withdraw the money, you have to be beyond reproach, right? You can't be any suspicion that you're pocketing any of the money. So you can't go in with a hem on your garment. You can't go in with shoes, with a sandal, with tefillin, with an amulet. Now the Gemara adds in here, long hair. Long hair, you can't go in. Why? What's the concern? Because once again, potentially you could hide money inside of your long hair. Tanya Gizbarn hayu mefasasin bikilkin. So also listen to this. The Gizbarin, so the Hashem says, mefasasin bikilkin means if they are wearing woolen garments that had strands of wool, you can see like with tzitzis, they would make sure to comb out the strands before they went in to take the money. Why? Because remember, once again, if the strands get tangled, they could form a little bit of a net, a solid piece, and you could potentially wrap up money in the strands. So they would separate out the woolen strands of their garment before they went in to withdraw money. Mostly listen to this interesting idea. Tani, midabrin hayu imo mishashu nichnas achashu yetze. So furthermore, again, when the person went in to withdraw money, they would go ahead and talk with him. They would engage him in conversation the entire time, from the time he went in to the time he went out. Both say why? Why? What does that do? Prevents him from putting money in his mouth. Right? Now again, remember, the idea over here is, I want to be clear, not that we're suspecting the person is going in. That's the whole yisod of it. Remember, if you have such suspicions about a person, then what? Don't send him in, send someone else. The idea over here is not that we're concerned that the guy going in is stealing money, but the idea is that the process has to be beyond reproach. The individual has to be naki, has to be totally clean. So the Gemara says, Tani, why don't you just have him fill up his mouth with water? In other words, why don't you have him fill up his mouth with water before he goes in and make him spit out the water when he comes out? That's why you know for sure that his mouth was filled with water. There's nothing more to talk about. He didn't put any money into his mouth. So the Gemara says, so we'll say that's actually quite interesting. Because as we're going to see, there was a bracha that was made. There was a bracha that was made before a person would withdraw the money. And obviously, if you had water in your mouth, you could not make the bracha. Isn't that incredible? I'll say. We're going to see over here, then we'll see what the bracha is. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'Sher b'Yonasan b'Torah b'Nevim m'Ksuvim ma'atzanu sh'adam tzarech l'tzeis yidei brios k'derech shu tzarech l'tzeis yidei hamakom. So we'll say we're going to see that in Tanakh, Torah Nevim and Ksuvim, we have psukim that highlight this idea that one must be beyond reproach in the eyes of man, in the same way that one is beyond reproach in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll say, this is the Yisur. We began to speak about this yesterday, this idea that a person is not allowed to see. Often it's tempting to say, I don't care what anyone thinks, as long as I know I'm doing the right thing, that's enough. And what the Gemara clearly tells us is, that is incorrect. A person does have to care what other people think, and a person's actions have to be beyond reproach in the eyes of man. So the Gemara says we have examples of this in all of Tanakh. The Gemara says, but Torah minai, where do you see this in the Torah? The pasuk says, you shall be clean. You shall be clean in the eyes of Hashem and of Yisrael. B'neviim minai dichsiv el Elokim Hashem, the Gomer v'Yisrael hu yada, b'ksuvim minayin. So we'll say again, that pasuk quoted over there was from Yehoshua. It was from Yehoshua. El Elokim Hashem hu yada, v'Yisrael hu yeda. It is known in the eyes of God, and it is known in the eyes of Yisrael. What about in ksuvim? D'chsivu matzachin v'seichel tov be'enei Elokim v'Adam. Literally finds favor and wisdom in the eyes of Hashem and in the eyes of man. So both say, I am obligated. It's such an incredible yesod in life, right? It's such a good way to live if we can only get to this level. Where both say, so many times in life I do something, and if somebody were to see me doing this thing, I'd have to explain it away in 1,000,001 different ways. The Gemara says, if you have to explain it, chances are it's not a good idea to do it, right? That's v'yisem nekiyim. That my actions should just be self-explanatory in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and in the eyes of man. Shal Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bun, Eizah mechuver shebekulam. By the way, out of all these psukim quoted, which is the best one? Which is the clearest one? So the Gemara says, Amar le v'yisem nekiyim me Hashem imi Yisrael. The best pasuk is the pasuk in Torah, where the pasuk says, you shall be clean, right? You shall be clean, you shall be nucky, pure in the eyes of Hashem, the eyes of Yisrael, which is why that's the pasuk that the Mishnah quotes, right? That's the pasuk that the Mishnah quotes. And therefore, I will say, again, I want to be clear. We don't actually have any suspicions regarding the guy going in to withdraw the funds. Because as we just said before, if we had actual suspicions about him, send someone else. But the idea is, even though we have no suspicions about him, so remember again, if the Mishnah would tell you he can't go in with the hem of the garment and the guy going in was the guy who we suspected, or he can't wear an amit, he can't wear tefillin, or can't have long hair, there's no chiddush. There's no chiddush. The idea is, even though I don't suspect him, I still can't have him go in with long hair, with shoes, with sandals, with tefillin, with an amulet, right? Without conversing with him. Why? V'yisem nikim. We'll say, what a muster about a way to live. Beautiful. Mishnah. Let's say this fast. We made a reference to this in yesterday's daf as well. Mishnah. Shal beis Rabbi Gamliel, hayu nichnas v'shaklo ben etzba'osav. The Zarkal Ifnei Atarim. So let's listen to this. So here's the image that's being painted. So both say, so remember again, we've been speaking about it until now. All the money was assembled in a particular chamber in the Beis Midrash. Now we've established that 3 times a year, someone would go in to go ahead and withdraw money. Remember again, what did he withdraw money with? Quick review, what did he withdraw money with? 3 utensils, 3 kalim. Right? How large are those utensils? They each held 3 sa'ah, which we discussed again, a sa'ah, somewhere between 4 and 5 gallons. And they would label the receptacles, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, or Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and they would fill them up. Now watch this. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says over here, that as the individual was filling up the utensils, in the household of Rabbi Gamliel had a very interesting practice. What was their practice? Someone from the household would walk into the chamber with his chatzi shekel between his fingers. So in other words, the coin itself was visible. And what would he do? The zarkol lifnei hatorem, he would throw it in the pile of money closest to the guy who was making the withdrawal. V'hatorem miskavein v'dachvu l'soch hakupa. And what would happen? The guy who was doing the withdrawal would see the coin, and he would purposely pull that coin into the kupa, into the basket, or into the receptacle. So we'll say, so what was happening over here? You see, the members of Rabbi Gamliel's household wanted to make sure that their coin was chosen. So what would they do? They would wait until the actual withdrawal was happening. And then they would go in to where the guy was withdrawing the money to the chamber with their coin visible and essentially throw it down right in front of the guy who was doing the withdrawal. The guy that was doing the withdrawal would make sure to pull their coin into the basket. We'll discuss why this was. Ein hatorem adshu omer lahem esrom veim omrim lo tarum. Furthermore, again, the guy making the withdrawal, there was a process. I will say first he would say, should I withdraw? And they would say, withdraw. Tarum es harishon v'chiba bekatablios. So we'll say what happens after he would make the first withdrawal. So we'll say, remember again, even though you're withdrawing 3 receptacles worth of money, obviously there was still a lot of leftover half shekels, right? There's a lot of money there. So what would happen? After he would perform the first withdrawal, he would cover the rest of the leftover coins with a leather cover. That's katablios, is a leather cover. Hashniya, v'chiba b'katablios, same thing when he would go in for the second withdrawal. So the second time I will say. So let's go with the first opinion, that the withdrawals were done 15 days before Pesach, 15 days before Shavuos, 15 days before Sukkot. So he would go in for the first withdrawal, he would withdraw the money. Remember, so he'd fill up 3 receptacles, right? 3 kupos that each hold 3 sa'ah. There's still a whole bunch of leftover coins. What would you do? They would cover the leftover coins. He would cover leftover coins with a leather cover. Same process with, so we'll say, then remember, then what would happen? What would happen? In between Pesach and Shavuos, we'll say, what would occur? What would occur? More coins come in. Because we'll say, remember, again, not everything gets in. Not everything gets in by Nisan. We saw this already, right? So now more coins would come in. Now we'll say, now what would happen is the second withdrawal then, which was done, let's assume when? 15 days before Shavuos, he would come in again, and where would he take this second withdrawal from? Where would the second withdrawal? It would come from the coins that accumulated on top of the leather cover. So the leather cover covered the leftover coins from the first withdrawal, right? All the coins that were there already 15 days before Pesach, right? Which essentially is the first of Nisan. Put the leather cover, then a whole bunch of other coins would come in between the first withdrawal and the second withdrawal. Second withdrawal was done from those new monies that came in. Then what would happen? Same idea. The chiba b'katablios. After the second withdrawal was made, then he would put a leather cover over what? Then the quote-unquote leftover coins. The leftover coins after the second withdrawal. Then Abba say, what would happen? He would come in 15 days before Sukkot, and then what would have occurred? More coins came in. Hashlishes lo haya mechaper. Rabbi say, interestingly enough, after now the third withdrawal was done from the new monies that came in as well. But I will say after the third withdrawal, he did not cover the leftover monies with a leather cover. Ultimately, again, why would he cover the leftover monies? Lest he go ahead and withdraw from monies that were already withdrawn. Then I will say, now the idea over here is, as we're going to see, according to this approach in the Mishnah, once you did a withdrawal, whatever money you got from the monies accumulated, great. The rest of those shkalim became what's called tiklin atikin, old shkalim, or leftover shkalim. We'll discuss exactly what you do with those. So the boss say it's really fascinating. So one more time, you would come in, you would do the withdrawal, fill up 3 baskets or 3 utensils of 3 sa'ah each, cover the leftover shkalim with a leather cover. Okay. Then more shkalim would come in afterwards, right? Sometime after the 15 days before Pesach. Second withdrawal, 15 days before Shavuos. Come in, take from the coins that accumulated on top of the leather cover. Whatever you have left over from there, put another leather cover. Third and final withdrawal for the year occurs 15 days before Sukkot. That comes from the money accumulated on top of the second leather cover. They would withdraw. Whatever money was left over at that point in time, no more leather covers. Right? They wouldn't cover anything. Again, so the Gemara says, Torah harishon l'shem Eretz Yisrael. So I'll say, interestingly enough, they went ahead and they called, the first collection was done on behalf of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Now, I will say, now remember again, we saw a very interesting fact about the way the withdrawals work. Remember, when they did the first withdrawal, Rabbi say, who was included in that first withdrawal? Who was part of that first withdrawal? Remember? Everyone. Because remember the way that the withdrawal works. The withdrawal is done on behalf of all of Klal Yisrael, including those who contributed and those who would contribute as well. But just ceremoniously, the way they went ahead and they attributed the first collection was done on behalf of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Vashnia l'shem krachan amukafin la. And ultimately, again, the second one was done for the Jews, ultimately, again, that were from a little bit further outlying areas. Vashlishes, and the third withdrawal, l'shem Bavel, u'l'shem Madai, u'l'shem Amud Beis, u'l'shem Medinos harachokos. And the third withdrawal was done from Jews who lived in further areas. Now, so again, just to be clear, when the Mishnah makes a statement, that's ceremonial. In other words, the withdrawal already from the beginning was done on behalf of all Jews. How do we know this? Well, say again, remember, what was the withdrawal for? What were you using this money for? Karbanos. What type of karbanos? Karbanos sibur, communal offerings. Who has to have a share in communal offerings? All Jews. So just to be clear, all Jews were included in the first collection, the second collection, and third collection. But rather, again, what they did a bit more ceremoniously. Good. So what they were doing ultimately was, right, the first monies were the Jews of Yerushalayim, the second monies the Jews of the rest of Eretz Yisrael, the third monies the Jews of outlying lands, so on and so forth. Says the Gemara. So I'll say, let's go back. So how did we start? We started with the interesting practice of the household of Rabbi Gamliel, who would wait to contribute their machzas hashekel until the withdrawal was actually being done. Then they'd walk into the area where the money was deposited and essentially throw the coin right in front of the gizbar, right in front of the guy who's making the withdrawal, and he would go ahead and make sure to include their coin in the withdrawal. Says the Gemara, Shal Rabbi Gamliel, Shal Beis Rabbi Gamliel, Ilu Hayashne Kariyim. Shnei karim v'tara me'echad mehen al chaveiro shemalo pater chaveiro. So we'll say, so let's take a step back for just a moment. Why did they need to do that? I was supposed to say, they make it sound like in order for them to be included in their karbanos hatzibor, ultimately what? Their money had to be included. But let's say you had two piles of produce right next to each other, and you take A and B, and you go out and you separate out shumas and maestros on pile A for pile B. Does that not work? Of course it works. So we'll say, so in other words, they're both piles of my produce. I have two piles sitting next to each other. So if I tithe from one pile to another pile, of course it works. So the Gemara is asking is, Rabbi Gamliel, if you throw your money into the pile, once it's in the pile, then what? Then what? You're included. So why do you need your money, dafka, to be withdrawn? To which the Gemara says, Hanachas ruach ilahem shalil yekarban miskaret ela mishalahen tchila. To which the Gemara says, you're right. This was not done to satisfy a halachic obligation, but rather, again, this was done to give nachas ruach. I will say nachas ruach means inner serenity, that the house of Rabbi Gamliel wanted to know that their monies were actually actively being used and withdrawn. Did they need that to be done in order to be part of the communal offerings? No. I will say, as we clearly see from the Mishnah, was all of the money collected withdrawn? Was all the money collected withdrawn? No. And yet everyone still has a portion. But rather, again, they wanted it. They wanted it. It was nice for them to know that their monies were actually being withdrawn. Good. Tani, Shamar Sakat Tablios Nasu Kulan Shirayim. So I'll say, interestingly enough, once you go ahead and put out the leather cover, the rest of the half shkalim that are there become what's called shirayim, leftover. So we'll say again, we'll discuss exactly what you do with the leftover shkalim. So the Gemara says, Tani, shlishis hi haisa ashira shebekulan. We'll say it's very interesting. The third collection, this is fascinating. The third collection, which also means, remember, as we pointed out, the shkalim came in at different intervals. So the third collection was actually the richest collection. Why was that? Shahayu ba istarios shazov v'darkono shazar. Remember again, we saw before that when you were bringing in machtes hashakal half shkalim from faraway lands, Chazal gave you the right to do what? Remember to do what? To redeem, to exchange them onto larger coins, just to make the transport easier. So I will say, so because of that, often the half shkalim that came in from faraway lands were often redeemed on much more expensive coins. So therefore, the third collection often had in the accumulation there much greater coins. There's actually much greater wealth in the third collection than the previous two, because it's coming from chutz la'aretz, and because again, the smaller coins were redeemed onto much larger denominations. Tani, Taramis Hayishon l'shem Eretz Yisrael, u'l'shem Kol Yisrael. So we'll say, here you see it. The Gemara says, when they withdrew the first monies by the first collection 15 days before Pesach, they withdrew it on behalf of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael and on behalf of all Am Yisrael. Shnia l'shem Krachin Amukafin. The second collection was done for the Jews of the walled cities, u'l'shem Kol Yisrael, and on behalf of all the Klal Yisrael. V'ashlishes l'shem Bavel u'Madai u'l'shem Medinos harachokos. The third withdrawal was done for the Jews of Babylonia, Madai, faraway countries, u'l'shem Kol Yisrael, on behalf of all the Jews. You're supposed to say, so this brisa is a bit more explicit than the Mishnah, because the Mishnah also said Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Second withdrawal, Jews of the walled cities, which was the outskirts of Eretz Yisrael. Right? Third withdrawal, Jews of faraway lands. Here the brisa just adds in, yes, first withdrawal, Jews of Eretz Yisrael and all of Klal Yisrael. Second withdrawal, Jews of walled city and all of Klal Yisrael. Third withdrawal, Jews of faraway lands and all of Klal Yisrael. So we'll say, so you see over here that it's much more ceremonial to say Jews of Eretz Yisrael, Jews of walled cities. We'll say, by the way, what do you mean walled cities? Remember, again, we'll say that refers to Jews who lived on the outskirts of Eretz Yisrael. Because where did you have walled cities? Where did you have walled cities? On the border, right? So what it means is it was just ceremonial and also made sense because, again, remember, the further you were, the more time it took for you to get your machtes hashakel in. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, Tani, not only in Arishona, Afa Bishesh Barishona, notel min hashniya. So I say, so remember again, now after you did the first withdrawal, as we said before, you cover the remaining coins with a leather cover. Now that's true even though there's still money left. There's still money left. Notel min hashniya. See, even though there's still money left in the first, you still do a new withdrawal from the second monies collected, which is monies which came in after you covered the leftover first monies. Similarly, again, notel min hashniya af al pi sheyesh b'shniya, notel min hashlishes. And I will say, same idea when you come to the third collection, even though there was still money left in the second collection, you only took from the new monies which came in post second collection. Money came in at different times. Right. So that's what it's saying. They wouldn't go ahead. They would leave that money. After the first collection, you cover the leftover monies, and then the new monies that come in, because they want to be able to do the collections from each batch of money that comes in. That's the goal over here. You want every collection to have a withdrawal for the karbanos tzibur. That's the idea. If you would just collect from the first, it could be that all the monies were coming from the first, and it would leave out the second and third collections. That way, again, you ensure that some money for communal karbanos comes from each wave of collections. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Shalmosh Lishis. So we'll say, what happens, interestingly enough, so with Pashtos, the way this would work was, remember, they wouldn't put a leather cover on the leftover monies after the third collection, which means that let's say you needed more money. So we'll say, so they do the first collection, cover up the leftover monies, cover up the leftover coins with the leather cover. Good. More money accumulates between the first collection and the second collection. Second collection done from the newly acquired monies. Do the second collection, cover the leftover monies with leather cover. Now more money accumulates between second collection and third collection. Go ahead and do the third collections from those newly acquired or newly accumulated monies. But let's say after they do the third withdrawal, now we need more money. We need more money. So what do you do? We'll say, so they would not, remember, they wouldn't cover the leftover monies after the third collection, which means that if you needed more money, where would you take it from? Where would you take it from? The leftover monies from the third collection. Good, says the Gemara. What happens, Shalmosh Lishis? Let's say you used up all of the monies from the third collection, which also means you did the third collection, and then you went back and you took more money, and you cleaned that. So what's this now? Remember, so when you walk into the chamber of Chatzi Shekels, what do you see now? What do you see now? What do you see now? The leather cover, right? What's underneath that leather cover? Money from the second collection. So now watch this. Shalmosh Lishis, Chozer L'Shniya. Then you take off the leather cover and use the surplus funds from the second collection. Shalmosh Shniya. What happens if you finished up the monies from the second collection? Uncover the first batch of money. Chozer L'Rishona. Shalmosh Lashtan. This is very interesting. What happens if you used up all of the monies? All of the monies. So what's the halacha? Chozer V'Shokel. Ultimately, again, you go ahead and you collect again. Look at the tiklin chadatin. He says, Shokel, tiklin chadatin, v'hainu heichad, dahayu karbonos merubin, v'otzia kala gimel kodem ha'perak ha'beis, v'loratz lomer likach me'ashirin, so we'll say, so again, interestingly enough, if somehow you run out of money, what can you do? Another collection. Very interesting. You can do another collection. Good. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir Omer, chozer l'shirayim. Rabbi Meir says, interesting enough, Rabbi say that no, you can go ahead and go back to leftover shekalim. Rabbi says we're going to see very often there was also leftover shekalim from previous years. Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maisa, you can go back to previously collected shekalim. Rabbi Meir Omer molim b'shirayim shemi yitzarchu lem basov. Because Rabbi Meir says old shekalim still have consecrated status. Varaya, if you use old shekalim, halacha l'maisa, you are chayiv for me'ilah. So Rabbi Meir says, we'll say, essentially, they never ran out. As we're going to see, they really never, ever ran out. In fact, again, more often than not, you always had leftover funds, and there's going to be a whole discussion again about what to do with those leftover funds, what we call tiklin atikin. There's tiklin chadatin, which are new shkalim, that year's collection, tiklin atikin, which were previous year's collections. So again, what we'll say, but interestingly enough, lamaisa, which you begin to see, we'll say, you have to understand what's happening over here, what's happening here. Just this process is, we want everyone to feel included. Right? We'll say, isn't this incredible? Now remember, I want to point out, this is modeled after the Mishkan itself. What was one of the most dramatic miracles in the Mishkan? One of the most dramatic miracles? Everyone's donation was accepted. Remember again, we know, I will say, by the Mishkan, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't contribute to the Mishkan. Why didn't he contribute to the Mishkan? Because he was afraid that his donation would block someone else's donation from being accepted. When he saw that miraculously, everyone's donation was accepted and used, Moshe Rabbeinu had tsar. He was upset that he did not contribute. Modeling after that same idea, we want everyone's contribution to be actively utilized. That's why also they're doing this withdrawal from each wave of contributions. And that's why, again, we're putting the other, we want we'll say an incredible Gemara right now, an incredible Gemara. Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair Omer. Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair used to say as follows. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, what we're going to see over here, what's the connection between what Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair is about to say and ultimately, again, what came before it. If you look at the Tikkun Chadatin for just a moment, Pinchas Ben Yair Omer, Zerizus, Adi Domer Barak Prakim, Shetzarech, Lios Nakim Yabrios, Kimo Midi Shamayim, Shetzar Lios Zoris, Kimo Shalves Rabbi Gamliel, Shia Lahem Tchila Mefarshchos. We'll say, interestingly enough, we're going to see that, well, let's see. Pinchas Ben Yair Omer. Zerizus mevia lidei nekios. If a person has zerizus, so also we know what is zerizus. Alacrity brings one to a state of spiritual cleanliness. And I will say, Tikkun Chadatin points out, why is this here? Because the Rabbi Gamliel's household had a lot of zerizus. Right? Why did they have a lot of zerizus? Because they wanted to make sure that not only did they contribute machzas hashakel, but what? They wanted to make sure that halacha l'maisa, their machzas hashakel was actively taken. That's what they wanted to make sure of. So we'll say, listen to how beautiful this is. Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair says, Zerizus brings one to Nekias. Now, I'll tell you a little bit of this outside. The Tikkun Chadatin writes, what's the pshat? So Zerizus, we know, alacrity. So I will say, there's two different types of Zerizus. There's positive Zerizus and negative Zerizus. What do I mean by that? There's a Zerizus to go ahead and run to do a mitzvah, and there's a Zerizus to run to avoid negative activity as well. I say we often only think about the Zerizus of the first kind, right? I'm Zoriz to run to do a mitzvah, but the same way that I have to be Zoriz to run to do a mitzvah, I have to be Zoriz to run away from that which is impure. Don't walk, don't saunter, don't stroll away from that which is negative. Run. The same way I run to positive things, run away from that which is negative. And if you run away from that which is negative, maybe lidei nekios, that ultimately leads me to a sense of spiritual purity or cleanliness, I'll say. Nekios, and I will say, if I run away from negative things, see, I will say, if I run away from that which is impure, I run away from negative influences, I run away from temptation, then nekios, mevi lidei tara, then ultimately, again, that leads me to a state of tara, right? I will say, because tara, if you take a look, if you take a look actually at the Tikkun Chadatin, he says, "Nekios mevi lidei tara." He goes on, he says, "V'chein ayidei nekios aguf me'avak chait ba l'taras hanashama she'ena Torah rak kli noki." So I'll say, if a person goes ahead and runs away from that which is impure, that leads one to a state of tara, to a state of purity. Tara mevia lidei kedusha, and I will say tara ultimately leads one to kedusha. If this sounds familiar, remember again, Mesilas Yesharim is model, right? The Ramchal went ahead and wrote an entire sefer based on what we'll call the stage theory of Rav Pinchas Ben Yair. A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, so on and so forth. So Tara mevi lidei kedusha. Ultimately, again, Tara leads me to kedusha. So I'll say, interestingly enough, what's kedusha? So if you look in the Karban Ha'ida, he writes that kedusha is kedushas halev machshava, purity of heart, purity of thought. So we'll say, what you see is something very interesting. If you condition yourself in a behavioral way, right? So if I run away from that which is negative, behaviorally, I run away from impure negative things, that ultimately creates a certain sense of Tara. Tara ultimately again creates Kiddusha. So we'll say what we begin to see is that my spiritual state is influenced by my physical behaviors. Kiddusha, mevili de'anava. Kiddusha, right? So again, Kiddusha, which means that ultimately, again, remember, according to the Karban Ha'ida, Kiddusha means purity of heart and purity of mind. That leads to humility. Because Rabbosai, when I begin to work on the way I think, and I begin to work on purity of thought, I begin to see how much work I have to do. Because Rabbosai, we all know that, it is much easier to control my behaviors than it is to control my thoughts. And when I begin to see how much of a struggle it is to control the way that I think, that leads me to a sense of humility. And I recognize that I still have so much more work to do. Anava, maybe and when I realize ultimately again that I have so much more work to do, that ultimately leads me to fear of sin. Because Rabbosai, when I'm humble, I realize how frail I am. When I'm humble, I realize how imperfect I am. And when I realize how imperfect I am, interestingly enough, that raises my vigilance level to how careful I have to be about sin. Otherwise, Rabbosai, if I'm not humble, if I'm arrogant, I think I've got this all done. If I think that I'm totally in control, nothing to worry about, that's when I stumble, that's when I sin. But if I'm humble and I realize how frail I am, and how imperfect I am, and how prone to sin I am, that leads me to a heightened level of vigilance in avoidance of sin. Yiras chet mevi alidei chasidus. And Abosai, when a person is vigilant about his actions, that's what yiras chet is. I fear sin. And therefore, I am vigilant about what I do and how I do it. I'm vigilant about the exposures I allow myself to have. I'm vigilant about the people I allow myself to be around. I'm vigilant about the circumstances in which I allow myself to be present in. That's maybe the chasidus. Both say, what's a chassid? What's a chassid? A chassid is someone who goes lifnim mishuras hadin, above and beyond. I'm not satisfied with just simply checking boxes or doing what's expected of me, but I want to go above and beyond. Chasidus. And when a person lives lifnim yeshuras hadin, goes above and beyond, you get Ruach HaKodesh. Now, both say, the Karban Ha'ida points out, because if you go above and beyond, then what? HaKodesh Baruch Hu goes above and beyond. If I say, Ribono Shalom, I'm not just going to do what I have to do to get by, but I'm going to be a chassid. I'm going to be someone who goes above and HaKodesh Baruch Hu says, oh, you're going above and beyond? I'm going to give you a relationship above and beyond as well. What is that relationship called? Ruach HaKodesh. We'll say Ruach HaKodesh, by the way, it doesn't have to mean prophecy. Ruach HaKodesh just means a heightened God awareness, a heightened God experience. If you go above and beyond for God, God goes above and beyond for you. Such an incredible idea. So the Gemara says, when you have Ruach HaKodesh, mevi alidei tchias hamesim. Wow. Right? And Ruach HaKodesh ultimately, again, brings one to tchias hamesim. We'll say what that means is, so here's the progression. If you're supernatural for God, God's going to be supernatural for you. And once you get into the realm of the supernatural, anything could happen. Anything could happen, even Tchias HaMesim. Tchias HaMesim maybe Dili Eliyahu. I will say Tchias HaMesim brings Eliyahu, which really means like this. Tchias HaMesim is a function of the Messianic era. And the Messianic era requires who? Requires Eliyahu HaNavi. Right? The Tchias HaMesim Mevia, Lidi Eliyahu V'Zirchatov. So we'll say, isn't this incredible? The godless of this statement, Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair says, is we'll say, what does everything start with? It's incredible. You could draw a straight line from beginning to end. How does a spiritual success begin? One word. What's the one word? Zerizus. But I will say the most important piece to remember in all of this is, it's a twofold Zerizus. It's Zerizus to run to do that which is good, and what? To run away from that which is negative. You see, everybody loves the good Zerizus, right? There's Zerizus to run to that which is good. That's much easier. It's much more difficult to run away from that which is negative, from that which is tamei, from that which is treif, to that which is destructive. But I will say that's what Zerizus is. And you could draw a straight line between Zerizus and Eliyahu Hanavi, between Zerizus and Moshiach. Everything starts with that one step which has two chalakim. Run towards that which is good, and run away from that which is negative and harmful. And if you keep that up, step after step after step, there is a straight line progression from Zerizus ultimately again to Moshiach. But I will say, what's the other Moshe Pinchas Ben Yair is saying? Is spirituality is a process. It's a process. You can't go from 0 to 16 under 3 seconds. Right? I will say it takes time. It takes time. Spirituality is a ladder. You go up one rung after the next. And I will say, again, we speak about this extensively. Rabbi Nachman speaks about this. I'll say Rabbi Nachman quotes, it's actually quite beautiful. The Gemara in Maseches Pesachim, if you remember, had a line, Yesh Zoriz v'niskar v'yesh Zoriz v'chote. Sometimes a person could have Zerizus and they get schar, and sometimes a person could have Zerizus and they're a sinner. Asks Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair says, Zerizus is great. How could Zerizus ever be bad? Rabbi say, listen to this incredible yesod. Rabbi Nachman says, when is Zerizus bad? What do you think? When is Zerizus bad? Zerizus is bad, says Rabbi Nachman, when you try to jump or skip steps in spiritual growth. See, Rabbi say, sometimes Zerizus is bad. Right? When I try to, spirituality is a process, and it's a step process, and you go from A to B to C to D. If you try to go from A to D, that's bad. That's Rabbi Nachman says, Yesh Zoriz v'chote. Sometimes Zerizus is bad. Sometimes Zerizus could be great. Do what you have to do quickly. Avoid negative things quickly, but don't skip steps. Don't skip steps. I was having this conversation like this with someone who told me he just turned 40 and he's ready to start learning Kabbalah. So it's funny because I was going to say to the person, it's excellent. First, you should work on davening with a minyan, right? Why don't you go not down? I don't give most. But I'm saying just like before you're going to Kabbalah, which is great. I'm sure it's great, right? I think there are like a couple of steps in between that, like putting on tefillin every day, davening tefillin b'tzibor, working on Kabbalah. Is learning Kabbalah incredible? 1,000%. But if I'm not doing basic things, and now I'm jumping to Torah Sanistar, that Zerizus is actually, again, counterproductive Zerizus. Yesh Zoriz v'niskar, yesh Zoriz v'chote. Zerizus is great, but it leads to step 2. And step 2 leads to 3, 3 leads to 4, so on and so forth. And if you keep down the journey, I will say, see, here's the chap, if you keep down the journey, you'll get to Moshiach. Let's just finish off the sugya quickly. So the Gemara says, Zerizus Mevila, in case, all the Gemara is going to do till the end of the parak now is just talk about the psukim that Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair bases his model of spiritual growth upon. Here we go. Zerizus Mevila de Nekios, Dechsiv, Vechila Mechaper, Nekios Mevila de Taro, Dechsiv, Vechipar La Akon V'Tahira. So I'll say, again, these are just the psukim that back up. Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair didn't invent this. Interestingly enough, we're going to see he gleaned it from the avoda of Yom Kippur. Right? The pasuk says, "V'chila mechaper." When the kohen finishes up his avoda, he will achieve kapara. So kila means you don't just finish up, but you finish up quickly. That's Zerizus, right? Nikios maybe. So that's Zerizus maybe de Nikios. Nikios maybe de Tara. How do Nikios brings that Tara? Dichsev v'chiper ala kohen v'tahira Tara maybe de kedusha dichsev v'tara v'kiddusho. Kiddusha mevia lide anava dechsev ki ko amar Hashem ram v'nisa shochin ad v'kadosh mamaron v'kadosh ashkon v'ezdaka v'shafa ruach anava mevia lide yiras achet dechsev ekev anava yiras Hashem yiras chet mevia lide chasidus dechsev v'chesed Hashem me'olam v'yad olam al yireav chasidus mevia lide ruach hakodesh dechsev az dibarta bechazon l'chasidecha ruach hakodesh mevia lide tchias hamesim dechsev V'nasati ruchi bachem v'chisem. Tchias hamesim v'il de Eliyah zachor l'tov d'chsiv. Hine anochi sholeach lachem es Eliyah hanovi. Lifnei bo yom Hashem hagodol v'anavos. Say the Torah we just went on Shabbos hagodol. So again, that tchias hamesim leads to Eliyah hanovi. We'll say so again. Remember the way we translate that is, what do you mean tchias hamesim leads to Eliyah hanovi? No, it's that once we are ro'ui for tchias hamesim, by definition, that necessitates Eliyahu Hanavi. And that's what the pasuk says. Hini anochi sholach lachem es Eliyahu Hanavi lifnei bo yom Hashem. Eliyahu Hanavi comes before the great day. So once you're on a level that you deserve Tchias HaMesim, by definition, that triggers the obligation for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to finally dispatch Eliyahu Hanavi. So I will say, what an incredible Gemara. Well, I will say, I urge you, it's Chol Hamoed, hopefully you have a little bit of extra time, so I urge you to take the time to reflect on this Gemara. Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair teaching us two incredible lessons. I will say, first of all, that spiritual growth is mamish. You could draw the line from Zerizus to Tchias HaMesim to Moshiach. Everything starts with Zerizus, not simple Zerizus, twofold Zerizus. Run to that which is good, run away from that which is harmful and deconstructive. Number two, I will say, Rabbi Nachman's words, Yesh zariz v'niskar, yesh zariz v'chote. Zerizus could sometimes become the beginning, the catapult for incredible spiritual growth and accomplishment, and sometimes erroneous Zerizus could become the undoing of the individual. Zariz, to take the right steps in the right sequential order, is incredible. But Zariz, to skip steps, could chas v'shalom be the undoing of it. I will say, let's end. Look how this ends. So incredible. Torah b'sheri meir omer. I will say, listen to this. Kol mi shekavua be'eretz Yisrael. Anyone who establishes his residence in Eretz Yisrael, right? There was like kavua. Someone who creates a kaviyas in Eretz Yisrael, and how incredible that we're learning this during one of the regalim. Whoever establishes residence in Eretz Yisrael, umedaber b'lashon hakodesh, and speaks Lashon HaKodesh. Lashon HaKodesh, well, so remember again, speaks, we translate it as Hebrew, but understand, of course, modern Hebrew is not Lashon HaKodesh. It's a derivative. It means speaks the language of the land. Speaks Lashon HaKodesh. V'ochel peirosav b'tara. And a person eats his fruits, which is a reference ultimately, again, to the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, right? And he makes sure to eat the fruit in a state of ritual purity. I will say, take a look for just a moment. Take a look, Peros Betara, and Neged Nefesh Hatzomacha. So I'll say, so a person goes ahead, because remember again, what you eat impacts your physicality. So a person makes sure to eat the fruit of Eretz Yisrael in a state of ritual purity, the Kori Kriya Shema Baboker Uba Erev, and you make sure to say Shema in the morning and in the evening, Yehe Muvusar Sheben Olam Haba Hu. I will say, such a person is it Ben Olam Haba. So let's listen to what the Yerushalmi's recipe. Now, by the way, it is interesting, by the way, this is a Yerushalmi, right? This is Masechet, right? This is Talmud Yerushalmi. So what does the Yerushalmi say? Okay, you Talmud Bavli guys, that's great. But let me just tell you the recipe for Olam Haba. Live in Eretz Yisrael, speak Lashon HaKodesh, eat your fruits in a state of ritual purity, say Shema in the morning and the evening. Well, say, think about this, what this means, by the way. Right? Live in Eretz Yisrael means what? Put yourself in holy circumstances. Right? I will say, what's the godless of living in Eretz Yisrael? The godless of living in the land of Israel is that I am placing myself. I see there's some of the Chevra from Orlando who's on over here. I just want to remind the Chevra in Orlando, you're not in Eretz Yisrael. Just because you have some palm trees and a lot of Israelis, that does not make it Eretz Yisrael. So I'll say, so again, what happens when you go ahead and you live, although the sky does look beautiful on Jeremy Lasson's picture over here, it does look quite beautiful. So I'll say, so what's the idea? Right? The idea is when you plant yourself in Eretz Yisrael, so you're going ahead and surrounding yourself with Kedusha. See, I will say, so much of spiritually successful living is surrounding yourself with the right influences. That's what it means. Shekavua be'eretz Yisrael. What does it mean to be kavua in Eretz Yisrael? To be kavua means I'm embedding myself. I'm embedding myself in a life structure of holiness. It's not just what you do in life that's important. It's where you put yourself. It's the circumstances in which you place yourself. So if I place myself in the right life circumstances, surround yourself with Kedusha. Number two, Medaber b'lashon HaKodesh. How do you talk? How do you talk? Let's say how a person talks says so much about who they are. The words I use, what I talk about. Let's say, what does it mean? You think Medaber b'lashon? What does it mean to be Medaber b'lashon HaKodesh? Is that a reference to Hebrew? We'll say, by the way, Jews did not always speak Hebrew, right? In fact, when Moshiach comes, everybody's going to start speaking Hebrew. Moshiach's for sure going to speak Yiddish. That's number one, right? I will say, what do you think? We're going to talk our regular languages. What do you mean? This we'll say. First, I just want to point out, speaking Hebrew by itself Where do you see that that's a Milah? Well, it is a Milah, because remember, again, one of the things that the Jews did not change when they were in Egypt was their Lasson. But perhaps Medaber Belashon HaKodesh means I speak in a holy way. It's not just a reference to the language you speak, but it's a reference to how you talk. Because how I talk and what I talk about is the greatest snapshot of where I'm holding in life. So step one, embed yourself in a lifestyle of Kedusha. Number two, make sure what you talk and how you talk about, what you talk about, are Dvarim Shebekdusha, are holy things. Number three, Ochel Peirosav Betara. Bosai means what? Literally, eat your fruit in a state of ritual purity. What it means is, how do you engage in physical pursuits? When you satisfy your physical wants and needs, is that done as a total Gashmi experience, a total physical experience? Or do you find the ability to infuse holiness, ruchnius, into the Gashmius? Isn't that the ultimate success of the Jew? To infuse ruchnius into the Gashmius, ochel peirosav betara. That when you eat, how does a Jew eat? When I eat, it's Kedusha also. Because why am I eating? I'm fueling my body because I want to go on to accomplish great things. My Gashmius is not an ends, it's a means to my ruchnius. Kol kriya shema b'boker be'erev. So what means what? I'm constantly working on my relationship with Hashem. What Shema? Shema is Kabbalah's Omachu Shamayim. Right? Shema ultimately is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Every morning and every evening, every day, I am working to further my relationship with Hashem. Such a person, Rabosai, person who lives in Eretz Yisrael, establishes for himself a framework of Kedusha, Medaber B'Lashon HaKodesh, is careful what he talks about and how he talks about it. A person who's ochel peirosav betara, infuses ruchnius into his gashmius. Person who's kori kriya shema shachris v'arbis. I work on my relationship day and night. Such a person is truly a Ben Olam Haba. But also I would posit that I think, remember again, when we speak about a person who's a Ben Olam Haba, it doesn't just mean where you're going after 120. When Chazal speak about the Ben Olam Haba, that also means what? About how to make your Olam Hazeh into an Olam Haba as well. There's the ability to make this world into the world to come. How? If you infuse meaning into it. If you live a life of meaning, create the right spiritual framework, go ahead and speak in the right way and about the right things, infuse ruchnius into your gashmius, work on your relationship with Hashem every morning and every evening, each and every day, then not only will you have a lichtiga gan Eden, a lichtiga olam haba after 120, but you'll be able to transform your olam hazeh, this world experience, into something magnificent as well. Hadron alach, perek b'shlosh prakim. Let's say shkoyach. We'll continue with the new parak tomorrow.